In the bustling heart of New Orleans during the 19th century, behind the grand houses and along the narrow streets, there lived those who toiled in silence and shadows. Among them were the enslaved men and women who carried the weight of the city's prosperity on their backs. Those who cooked the food, cleaned the homes, and served the masters with obedience expected but rarely rewarded. Inside the kitchens, where the heat of the fire never ceased, and the aroma of rich Creole dishes filled the air, an invisible battlefield was unfolding. The kitchen was not only a place of servitude, it was a place of power. The enslaved cooks held the daily lives of their owners in their hands, seasoning the meals that would sustain them, preparing the drinks that would refresh them, and standing over fires that burned day and night. Yet within this space, resentment festered. Every cut of the knife, every stirring of the pot carried the weight of injustice. The hand that appeared obedient could also become the hand of quiet rebellion. In a city where the whip cracked without mercy and freedom seemed a distant dream, some chose a path that was subtle but deadly. The poison hidden in a meal was not loud like a revolt, nor visible like an uprising, but it was just as powerful. It required patience, courage, and the knowledge that food could be transformed from sustenance into a weapon. To serve a master a dish laced with poison was to take control, if only for a moment, of a life that otherwise held no control at all. New Orleans, with its mixture of cultures, traditions, and tensions, became a place where whispers spread of kitchen slaves who turned meals into instruments of vengeance. The act was born not merely from hatred, but from years of being treated as less than human, years of humiliation, pain, and separation from loved ones. For some, poison was the only way to make the oppressor feel fear, to remind them that even the most loyal-looking servant could be the architect of their downfall. In the grand houses of New Orleans, where chandeliers glittered above dinner tables and fine porcelain held steaming dishes of Creole cuisine, few gave thought to the hands that made such luxury possible. Yet in the dim, smoke-filled kitchens, behind the polished walls of wealth and status, lay a space that held more power than the masters of the house could ever imagine. The kitchen was not just a room for preparing food, it was the heart of the household, and those forced to labor within it carried a form of influence that was both invisible and extraordinary. To outsiders, the kitchen slave appeared to be the least threatening figure in the household. They were bent over pots, grinding spices, washing vegetables, and stirring sauces with mechanical precision. They worked in silence, often barefoot, sweating before open fires while serving meals with an outward display of loyalty. But this role, though cloaked in servitude, came with a subtle kind of authority. Every morsel of food that passed a master's lips was prepared by enslaved hands. Every drink poured, every bread baked, every delicacy enjoyed was touched and controlled by someone society had labeled powerless. This dependence created a paradox. The very people treated as inferior were, in fact, entrusted with the sustenance and survival of their oppressors. In this paradox lay the first spark of hidden power. The master might command, punish, and humiliate, but when he sat down to dine, he unknowingly surrendered his life to the discretion of the one who cooked his food. The knowledge of ingredients, herbs, and preparation techniques turned the cook into a quiet guardian, or a silent executioner. This awareness was not lost on those who lived daily under the weight of chains. For many enslaved women and men, the kitchen became a battlefield where weapons were not muskets or machetes but spices, powders, and bitter, tasting plants that could be slipped unnoticed into a dish. The atmosphere of the kitchen was filled with more than just the scent of gumbo and jambalaya. It carried with it years of anger, humiliation, and grief. Every chore was a reminder of captivity. Every order barked across the room a blow to dignity. Yet as they ground herbs with stone mortars or stirred pots over flame, they also carried the knowledge that their hands had the power to turn ordinary meals into instruments of fate. This was not mere cooking. It was a form of control in a world where control was otherwise stolen from them. The kitchen also provided something else: proximity. Unlike those who labored in the fields, cooks were close to the family that enslaved them. They overheard conversations, learned routines, and gained an intimate understanding of the vulnerabilities of those who oppressed them. The master who believed himself untouchable was, in truth, dependent on the loyalty of the one who served him. The dining table, so often seen as a symbol of abundance and refinement, was also a place of danger, a reminder that power in its most refined form can sometimes sit quietly waiting for its moment. For enslaved cooks, this hidden power was both a burden and a weapon. It was a burden because they were forced daily to serve those who caused them immeasurable suffering. Yet it was also a weapon because they knew that at any moment, the simple act of seasoning a dish could become an act of rebellion. Masters could lock doors, carry whips, and command armies of overseers, but none of that could protect them once a meal was set before them. The kitchen, overlooked by those who feasted in the parlor, was the most dangerous room in the house. This reality created an undercurrent of unspoken fear. Slaveholders lived in outward confidence, but carried an inner awareness of vulnerability. They might not admit it, but they knew their survival depended on trust in those who had every reason not to be trusted. The kitchen slave, appearing as the lowest in the household hierarchy, held in their hands the most essential of human needs: food, sustenance, and life itself. This was their hidden power, silent yet undeniable, shaping the balance between oppression and resistance in ways history rarely acknowledges. Food has always been more than mere sustenance. It is culture, tradition, comfort, and survival. In the world of the enslaved, however, food became something far greater. It was transformed into a weapon, one of the few instruments of resistance available within the confines of captivity. To the masters of New Orleans, the meals served at their tables were symbols of wealth and refinement, but to the enslaved men and women laboring in the kitchens, those same meals could carry hidden meanings, dangerous secrets, and the possibility of vengeance disguised as nourishment. Poisoning food was not an act chosen lightly. It was a decision that carried with it both risk and desperation, for discovery meant brutal punishment or death. Yet it also carried a profound sense of justice for those who had been denied it in every other sphere of life. When chains bound their wrists and the whip lashed their backs, when every attempt at escape was hunted down and crushed, food became the battlefield on which the powerless could strike a blow. A pinch of powder, a drop of liquid, or the crushed root of a bitter plant could be mixed quietly into a stew or a drink, invisible to the eye but potent enough to change the course of a household's fate. The act was terrifying in its subtlety. Unlike open revolts or riots, which were loud and violent, poisoning was silent. It struck without warning and without spectacle, leaving confusion and fear in its wake. A master might dine in luxury one evening and find himself writhing in agony the next, never truly certain whether it was illness, accident, or the hidden hand of rebellion. That uncertainty was as powerful as the poison itself. It reminded slaveholders that despite their whips, chains, and guns, they were not untouchable. The very food they depended on could betray them. For the enslaved, knowledge was key. Many came from African traditions where the use of herbs, roots, and natural remedies was deeply understood. This knowledge traveled with them across the Atlantic, surviving even through the horrors of the Middle Passage. In the kitchens of Louisiana, surrounded by the bounty of the land and the city's thriving markets, these traditions mingled with European and Caribbean ingredients, giving enslaved cooks an intimate understanding of flavors, seasonings, and, importantly, poisons. What to a master was just another exotic spice or unfamiliar herb, could to the enslaved be a carefully chosen tool, one that turned a meal into a calculated strike. But this was not simply about destruction. Poisoning food was a way of reclaiming power in a world designed to strip power away. It was a declaration, silent yet fierce, that those deemed voiceless could still be heard, that those treated as property could still resist. The act itself was a language, one that spoke not with words, but with the bitter taste of fear left in the mouths of the oppressors. And though few stories were openly recorded, because fear of acknowledging the practice would only feed paranoia, the whispers of poisoned meals circulated among households, creating an atmosphere of mistrust that hung heavily over every dinner table. In a city as rich and diverse as New Orleans, where French elegance mingled with African rhythms and Caribbean traditions, the kitchen stood at the crossroads of power and vulnerability. The masters dined in grandeur, believing themselves secure, yet every forkful they lifted carried the possibility of rebellion disguised as a meal. To the enslaved, this act was not just survival, it was revenge, justice, and defiance served on a plate. Food, so often seen as a gift, became a curse. And in the hands of those forced to serve, it transformed from a symbol of hospitality into one of the most effective and terrifying weapons of resistance. Resistance in the age of slavery is often remembered in the form of revolts, uprisings that shook plantations, rebellions that spread fear across towns, and daring escapes that became legends. Yet not all acts of defiance were loud, bloody, or visible to the outside world. Some of the most effective forms of resistance were carried out in silence, in shadows, and within the ordinary routines of daily life. Among these, the act of poisoning stood apart as one of the most secretive and unsettling methods. It did not require armies or weapons, only patience, cunning, and a willingness to wield subtlety as a weapon. The enslaved lived under constant watch. Overseers monitored the fields, masters commanded every move in the household, and punishments were swift for even the smallest disobedience. In such a world, plotting open rebellion was nearly impossible. But silent acts of defiance, carefully hidden beneath gestures of obedience, slipped past the gaze of authority. To poison a drink, to stir something into a meal, or even to threaten the possibility of it, required no uprising. It required only a moment, a carefully chosen instant when no one was looking, a flick of the hand that left no trace but carried deadly consequence. The genius of this method lay in its invisibility. Unlike revolts, which were met with armies and retaliation, silent resistance was nearly impossible to detect until the effects had already taken hold. A master might fall ill and never know why. A family might grieve the sudden loss of one of their own, never daring to suspect the hand of the servant who had so faithfully brought meals to the table, and even when suspicion arose, proof was scarce. This uncertainty was its own weapon. It left oppressors uneasy, forcing them to question every bite they swallowed, every sip they drank. The silence of the enslaved became the loudest message of all, the message that no amount of control could ever fully erase their agency. Such defiance also carried a psychological edge. To the enslaved, the act of secretly lacing food was not merely about causing physical harm. It was about reclaiming dignity in a world that denied them humanity. Every successful act of hidden resistance reminded them that power could be inverted, that those who claimed ownership over their bodies could never fully control their spirit. To serve poison in silence was to create fear in the very heart of the oppressor, to remind them that dependence on their servants made them vulnerable. It was a quiet declaration that even in bondage, resistance could thrive. For the masters, this silence bred paranoia. They could trust neither the cook who prepared their meals nor the maid who poured their wine. Even the most obedient, seeming servant carried the potential for betrayal. This fear fractured the illusion of absolute dominance. It revealed that control was never total, that beneath the appearance of submission lay the constant threat of rebellion. And because these acts were cloaked in quietness, they could not be fully eradicated. Punishments might be carried out, but suspicion always lingered, a shadow cast over every household. These silent acts of defiance were not limited to poisoning, breaking tools in the field, feigning illness, working slowly, or secretly preserving cultural traditions were all methods of resistance that lived beneath the surface of daily life. Yet poisoning held a particular power because of its intimacy. It targeted the oppressor directly, personally, and invisibly. It was not a broad rebellion meant to free hundreds. It was an individual strike, one that turned the master's own dependence against him. In this way, silence became a shield and a sword. The enslaved could not speak their defiance aloud, for words would be punished. Instead, their silence concealed it, carried it, and transformed it into action. It was rebellion disguised as obedience, power hidden in plain sight. And though history has often overlooked these quiet forms of resistance, they tell us that survival itself was an act of courage, and silence, far from being weakness, was sometimes the strongest form of defiance. The choice to turn food into a weapon did not appear out of thin air. It was born from centuries of cruelty, humiliation, and despair. For those held in bondage, every day was a reminder that their lives were not their own. They were stripped of freedom, separated from families, and forced into endless labor with no hope of reprieve. The fields, the kitchens, the workshops, each place carried the weight of oppression, and each hour under the sun or by the fire carved deeper scars into the soul. Out of this soil of suffering, the roots of rebellion began to grow. To understand why some chose to slip poison into a master's meal, one must look at the relentless conditions they endured. Imagine rising before dawn, shackled not by chains but by the knowledge that your day was already owned by someone else. From morning until night, every task was commanded, every breath monitored, every mistake punished with a whip or worse. Those who toiled in kitchens were spared the brutal fields, but endured a different kind of torment. Long hours, oppressive heat, and the constant presence of those who belittled and degraded them. Cooking became not just work but a daily reminder of servitude, of serving lavish meals to people who treated them as property. Injustice pressed heavily upon them in every interaction. A smile had to be forced even when exhaustion gnawed at their bones. Words had to be spoken with care, for the wrong tone could provoke violent reprisal. Even the smallest shred of dignity was constantly under threat. Mothers saw children sold away, husbands watched wives humiliated, families were torn apart without mercy. Every injustice piled upon another until the soul ached with a pain that had no outlet. For many, this suffering festered into anger. And anger, when bottled too long, seeks release. The kitchen offered a bitter kind of opportunity. Here, the enslaved were close to their oppressors in ways others were not. They stood by as masters feasted, watched them laugh in comfort, and witnessed them live lives of luxury bought with the sweat and tears of others. The food they prepared was a symbol of the imbalance. The enslaved cooked it but could not eat it, touched it but could not claim it, created it but received none of its joy. That food became a mirror of injustice itself, and in time, it also became the perfect tool for resistance. The decision to poison, then, was not simply about revenge. It was about reclaiming a shred of control in a world where control was stolen. To add something bitter into a meal was to say, without words, "You may own my body, but you do not own my will." It was an act born from deep wounds, from years of silence, from pain that could no longer remain buried. It was the voice of the voiceless, expressed in the only way left available. But this choice also reflected the depth of their humanity. It showed how profoundly injustice can reshape a person's actions. People who were denied education, freedom, and dignity turned to the tools they did have, knowledge of herbs, plants, and remedies passed down from generations. They took skills forced upon them, such as cooking, and turned them into instruments of rebellion. This act revealed both the cruelty of the system and the resilience of those forced to live under it. When we look at these acts, it is easy to judge them harshly, but to do so ignores the weight of centuries pressing down on their shoulders. These were not people born with malice. They were people driven to extremes by relentless cruelty. Poison was not just bitterness in a cup. It was the accumulated bitterness of generations poured into one decisive act. It was the cry of people who had been silenced for too long, expressed in the only way they could make their oppressors feel what they themselves endured: fear, pain, and vulnerability. Fear is a shadow that lingers long after the candle has been snuffed out, and in the grand homes of New Orleans, that shadow followed every meal to the table. Slaveholders projected authority, wealth, and power, but beneath the polished veneer lay a constant and unspoken dread, the awareness that those who cooked their food and poured their wine might also be plotting their downfall. It was an unease that could not be erased by locks, whips, or overseers, for it existed in the most intimate of spaces, the very act of eating. The enslaved were forced into positions of service so close, so unavoidable, that the lines between dependence and vulnerability blurred. A master could command obedience, but he could not control the unseen hand that seasoned his stew or stirred his coffee. The very survival of the household depended on the loyalty of the enslaved, a loyalty that was assumed but never guaranteed. And this reality haunted the minds of those who claimed dominance. They could never truly know if the meal before them was safe or if it was laced with rebellion disguised as flavor. Stories, rumors, and whispers of poisoning spread quietly through plantations and cities. Sometimes they were based in truth, other times in paranoia. A sudden illness, a lingering sickness, or an unexplained death could ignite suspicion. Was it natural? Was it fate? Or was it the silent hand of a servant exacting justice in the only way possible? The uncertainty was as lethal as the act itself. Even without proof, the possibility bred fear, and fear gnawed away at the confidence of the oppressors. This fear reshaped relationships between masters and the enslaved. Outwardly, slaveholders demanded loyalty and obedience, yet inwardly they questioned it. They scrutinized the cook who had served them faithfully for years, watched the servant who poured their wine, and wondered what secrets might be hidden behind a seemingly calm expression. The very people they relied upon most became the source of their greatest anxiety. Dependence bred mistrust, and mistrust bred paranoia. The atmosphere of dread was not confined to one household. It spread across the South, seeping into the consciousness of slaveholding communities. Newspapers occasionally hinted at cases of poisoning, though details were often buried to prevent panic. Private conversations carried the weight of warning: beware of the kitchen, beware of the hands that serve you. It was a quiet terror that destabilized the illusion of absolute control. For all their power, masters knew that they were never entirely safe, not even in their own homes. For the enslaved, this fear was its own form of resistance. Even the rumor of poisoning was powerful. It did not require the act itself. Sometimes the mere possibility was enough to create unease. Fear became a weapon wielded without sound or spectacle, forcing oppressors to live with the same uncertainty and vulnerability that the enslaved endured daily. Every bite of food, every sip of drink carried with it the echo of danger, a reminder that the enslaved were not powerless. The presence of this fear reveals the cracks within the system of slavery itself. Though designed to strip away humanity and reduce people to property, the institution was never as absolute as it pretended to be. Beneath the surface of control lay dependency, and within dependency lived vulnerability. The very system that demanded obedience had created its own undoing, for it placed enslaved people in positions where their silent defiance could thrive. This is why the kitchen became such a fraught place. To the master, it was a source of comfort and abundance. To the enslaved, it was a space of toil but also of possibility, and between those walls, fear simmered just as much as the stews on the fire. It was a fear that haunted every dining room, every parlor, every banquet. It reminded the oppressors that power could never shield them completely, that domination was always fragile, and that sometimes the quietest acts carried the loudest consequences. History is often written by the powerful, and in those accounts, the enslaved appear only as nameless figures laboring in fields or serving in households. Yet beneath those silences lie stories of defiance, endurance, and acts of resistance that shaped the very foundations of life in places like New Orleans. The legacy of kitchen slaves who used poison as a weapon is one such story, one that rarely makes its way into textbooks or celebrated histories. Still, it lingers, whispered across time, a reminder that rebellion was not only fought on battlefields but also in kitchens, with spoons, herbs, and silent determination. The erasure of these stories was not accidental. Slaveholders and those who came after them had little interest in preserving accounts that revealed vulnerability. To admit that enslaved cooks held power over their masters' survival was to expose the cracks in the system of dominance. It was far easier to write narratives of loyalty, obedience, and docile servitude than to record the reality of mistrust, fear, and rebellion simmering behind the kitchen doors. Thus, much of this history slipped into shadow, carried not in official records but in oral traditions, folklore, and fragmented whispers. But forgetting does not erase truth. The reality is that these acts of quiet resistance shaped the lives of both enslaved people and their oppressors. For the enslaved, it was a form of reclaiming identity and agency, however dangerous the choice. For the masters, it was a reminder that their power was never absolute, that even in their most private moments of indulgence, they remained dependent on those they sought to control. The legacy of these acts, though seldom acknowledged, reveals a history far more complex than the polished portraits of Southern grandeur suggest. When we look closely, we find traces of this hidden legacy in the unease that haunted slaveholding households. Paranoia about food and drink, suspicion toward even the most trusted servants, and the occasional hushed record of sudden deaths point to an undercurrent of defiance that history has tried to overlook. Each of these acts, recorded or unrecorded, was not simply about ending one life. It was about sending a message across generations that survival under bondage did not erase resistance, that silence did not mean submission. The forgotten legacy of these quiet rebellions also speaks to the broader story of enslaved people in America. Resistance took many forms, some grand, like organized revolts or daring escapes, and others small but deeply symbolic, like breaking tools, working slowly, preserving forbidden traditions, or slipping poison into a master's cup. Each act chipped away at the myth of total control, proving that oppression could never fully erase the human will to fight back. The kitchen poisonings stand as one of the most haunting examples of this truth. Their absence from mainstream history is itself a testament to the enduring power of silence. The system of slavery depended on the illusion of order and obedience. To openly acknowledge that enslaved people could wield such intimate power would have shattered that illusion. And so, these stories were buried, erased, or dismissed as rumor. Yet their very absence draws attention to what they represent, a form of resistance so effective, so unsettling, that history itself sought to silence it. Remembering these hidden stories is not simply about recounting acts of rebellion. It is about honoring the humanity of those forced into bondage, acknowledging that they were never mere victims but actors in their own right, capable of choices, courage, and defiance, even under the harshest conditions. Their legacy is not written in the grand monuments of New Orleans, but in the quiet strength that endured in its kitchens, in the whispered fears of the oppressors, and in the resilience of a people who refused to be entirely broken. The kitchen slave who served poison is not just a figure of the past, but a symbol of resistance that speaks to the present. It is a reminder that history's loudest voices are not always its truest, and that sometimes the most powerful legacies are the ones hidden in silence, waiting to be uncovered.